The year was 1830, a time when the English countryside seemed to live in two worlds at once. On the surface, the villages and sprawling estates gave the image of peace and order. Horse-drawn carriages carried families along narrow roads. Women in fine dresses gathered for afternoon teas, and the church bells rang each Sunday as if nothing could disturb the rhythm of life. But beneath the surface of wealth and refinement, whispers of unrest always lingered. Unseen grudges, private scandals, and secrets that traveled through towns faster than the wind. That it was in the rolling fields of Warwickshire that the story of the Cunningham sisters began. Their family estate stood apart from the rest. A large stone house framed by acres of green, with ivy climbing across its walls and heavy wooden doors that creaked under the weight of age. To the villagers who passed by, the Cunninghams were a picture of status and discipline. Their fortune was old, tied to the land and to generations of men who had built their names in politics and trade. The family carried itself with a kind of quiet authority, rarely questioned by those who lived in their shadow. Inside the house, however, life did not unfold with the same ease it had from afar. The walls were heavy with silence, as if each corridor stored words never spoken. The sisters, who would one day be remembered not for their beauty or charm, but for something far darker, lived under that roof in a world where appearances mattered more than truth. They moved through rooms decorated with fine portraits and thick carpets, yet behind the polished veneer lay a family divided by tension. Their lives, though wrapped in comfort, carried the weight of something unsteady, something waiting to break. Neighbors who caught glimpses of the sisters described them as close, perhaps too close. Where one walked, the other followed. Their voices were soft, and their movements careful, almost measured. Yet behind their eyes, there was a sharpness that unsettled those who looked long enough. They were admired, envied, and in some corners quietly feared. The sisters were bound by blood and by circumstance, and though their bond was often spoken of with warmth, there was an intensity in it that hinted at something less innocent. The days on the Cunningham estate were filled with rituals meant to display order. The family dined together at long tables lined with silverware polished to a mirror shine. Servants kept the house in perfect condition, though they whispered in the kitchens about the strictness of their employers. Every action was measured, every expression weighed. And still, beneath this performance of elegance, the tension grew. The sisters lived in a household where obedience was demanded, where a wrong word could bring shame, and where the lines between love and control blurred with each passing day. The land around them, though beautiful, carried its own weight of history. Villagers still told tales of old feuds, of family names tarnished by greed or betrayal. In such a place, respectability was fragile. The smallest scandal could ruin an entire bloodline, and so the wealthy lived in constant fear of being exposed. For the Cunninghams, the pressure to maintain their image was relentless, and the sisters grew up under that shadow. To them, reputation was not just a word. It was survival that on quiet evenings, when the candles flickered low and the halls seemed almost too still, one could feel the undercurrent of unease. The sisters whispered to each other in ways no one else could hear, their secrets protected behind locked doors. Servants claimed to have seen them in heated discussions that ended in silence, their faces pale, their hands clenched. But nothing was ever spoken aloud, and so the rumors remained just that, rumors to those outside their world. The Cunninghams lived a life most could only dream of. They were clothed in silk, their futures seemed secure, and they were expected to marry well, as all daughters of wealthy families were meant to do. Yet those who looked closely might have noticed the cracks. The way the sisters avoided certain family gatherings. The way they lingered too long in the garden at night, as if hiding from the house that was supposed to protect them. The way their laughter sometimes carried a sharpness, more like mockery than joy. It was clear that behind their polished appearances, darker forces shaped their lives. Control ruled every corner of their home, and silence became their shield. Love, loyalty, and obedience intertwined until one could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. In such a fragile world, it took only the smallest push for everything to collapse. And when it did, the secrets they had guarded so fiercely would spill into the open, staining their family name forever. For now, in 1830, Warwickshire slept under its usual veil of calm. Carriages rattled down dirt roads, farmers returned from their fields, and church bells reminded all of the steady rhythm of life. But in the Cunningham house, the air was thick with unspoken truths. The sisters lived side by side, bound by love, fear, and something neither dared name. And though no one yet knew it, their secret was not only dangerous, it was deadly. The days that followed the calm veneer of life on the Cunningham estate began to take on a different tone, though to the outside world it seemed nothing had changed. The sisters still strolled together in the gardens, their dresses brushing against the lavender as if they were two shadows tied at the hip. They still attended the Sunday services with lowered eyes and careful smiles, still exchanged polite greetings with the neighbors. Yet within the walls of their home, the quiet had started to sharpen into something far less peaceful. It began with small frictions. The elder sister had always carried herself with an authority that was hard to ignore, a kind of dominance rooted not only in her age, but in her sharp way of speaking. She was careful with her words, but the younger often felt the sting of them more than anyone else. What had once seemed like guidance or protection began to feel like control, an invisible hand pressing against her every choice. Servants noticed how the younger's eyes lingered on her sister with a mixture of longing and resentment, as though she could not decide whether she wanted to follow her or break free. Jealousy crept in quietly. The elder sister attracted attention wherever they went. Men bowed their heads a little lower. Women whispered about her poise. She was seen as the one with the future, the one destined to marry into another wealthy family and carry the Cunningham name with honor. The younger, though not lacking in beauty or grace, found herself compared in ways she could never escape. Compliments directed at her often came with reminders of her sister's brilliance, as though she could only be measured against the other shadow. And shadows, no matter how long, always smothered the light beneath them. The pressures of society pressed harder than ever. Their father, whose health had begun to decline, spoke often of their duty to uphold the family's reputation. Marriage, wealth, and status were not options, they were obligations. Suitors began to visit the house, their interest clearly directed toward the elder sister. Each visit left the younger feeling more like an afterthought, more like an ornament than a person. She smiled when she was expected to, laughed at the right moments, but behind closed doors, her bitterness boiled. Why was she destined to be the lesser one, the forgotten one, while her sister shone in every room? The sisters' bond, once admired as unbreakable, began to twist. The elder grew protective in a way that no longer felt like love, but like possession. She warned the younger about the dangers of independence, about the risk of shame if one strayed from the path laid out by their family. Her words were meant to sound like care, but they carried the weight of command. The younger began to feel suffocated, as if her sister did not want her to grow, but to remain forever under her shadow. What others saw as devotion was, in truth, a cage that it was in these moments that their whispered arguments began. In the dead of night, when the house was quiet and the servants asleep, their voices carried through the stone corridors, sharp, cutting, filled with pain. The younger accused her sister of treating her like a child, of taking what should have been hers. The elder lashed back with threats and cold truths, reminding her of her place, of what was expected, of how much worse things could be if she dared to defy. Neither could stop, for the more they spoke, the more their anger fed itself, until silence was the only way to keep from tearing each other apart. There were secrets, too, that no one spoke of openly, but which hung between them like a constant shadow. Whispers of past grievances lingered, half buried by time, but never forgotten. A cruel remark from childhood, a promise broken, an act of betrayal disguised as love. These memories festered in the younger's heart, each one fueling her need to break free from the elder's grip. For the elder, The fear of losing control over her sister became her deepest terror. She believed that without her guidance, without her hand keeping the younger in place, ruin would follow. And so, what had once been love transformed into something darker, an obsession with control, a refusal to let go. The world outside their home only tightened its hold. Their father's wealth was not as secure as it once had been. Rumors swirled of debts, of investments gone wrong. The idea that one or both sisters would need to marry became more urgent, less about choice and more about survival. The pressure mounted until it seeped into their every conversation, every dinner, every glance across the table. To marry was to save the family name. To refuse was to destroy it. And yet, only one of them seemed to hold the key to the suitor's affections. The younger's resentment grew into something heavier. Each day, she felt herself pushed aside, treated as less valuable, less necessary. Each night, she replayed her sister's words, her warnings, her commands, until they twisted into taunts in her mind. She began to wonder what it would be like to live without the elder's shadow hovering over her, what it would mean to finally step into her own life without being told how to live it. These thoughts, once fleeting, became constant companions. They whispered to her in quiet moments, tempting her with a kind of freedom she had never known. For the elder, the fear of losing her sister became a kind of madness. She had built her identity on their bond, on being the leader, the protector, the one who held them both steady. To imagine her sister breaking away, to imagine her choosing her own path, filled her with dread. She could not allow it. Not when the family's future depended on their unity. Not when her own worth was tied to the younger's obedience. And so, she tightened her grip, speaking more harshly, watching more closely, holding on with a desperation that frightened even herself. The servants, who saw more than they should have, whispered about the growing strangeness in the house. They noticed how the sisters avoided one another during the day, only to be heard in muffled argument. T.S. at night. They noticed the younger's tear-stained face, the elder's cold stares, the way the air between them seemed to thicken whenever they entered the same room. Some said it was simply the strain of young women under pressure. Others whispered that something more sinister was brewing. And indeed, something was. Each word spoken in anger, each glance filled with envy or fear, added weight to a scale that could not hold forever. The love that once bound the Cunningham sisters together was no longer love as anyone else would understand it. It had become a battle for control, for freedom, for survival. The walls of their estate, heavy with silence and secrets, seemed to press tighter with each passing day. The younger sister, once meek and compliant, now carried within her a storm that no one could see until it would break. The elder, once calm and commanding, now trembled at the thought of losing her grip. Both were trapped in a world of expectations and unspoken rules, bound by family duty and by the weight of their shared past. Neither could escape without destroying the other. And so, the tension grew, fed by jealousy, by fear, by the crushing force of society's demands. Each day brought them closer to the edge, though neither dared admit it. The air in the Cunningham house was no longer heavy with silence alone. It was heavy with the promise of something terrible yet to come. Something that once unleashed could never be undone. The night the Cunningham house erupted into tragedy began like so many others, with the halls cloaked in silence, and the air carrying that strange weight of things unsaid. A storm had gathered over Warwickshire that evening, clouds heavy and bruised across the sky, pressing low against the earth. Rain lashed at the windows, and the wind groaned through the trees that lined the estate. Inside, candles flickered against the stone walls, their flames bending with each draft that slipped through the cracks. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for what it somehow already knew was coming. The sisters had eaten in near silence at the long oak table. Their father had taken to his chambers earlier, complaining of fatigue, leaving them alone in the cavernous dining room. The clatter of cutlery against porcelain was the only sound between them. The elder's eyes were sharp, watching her sister across the table as though every movement carried meaning. The younger kept her gaze low, her jaw tight, her hands trembling slightly as she cut in her food. Tension had simmered all day from a moment they had woken in the same room tea. Oh, the whispered arguments in the garden when no one was near. Tonight it felt unbearable, as though the storm outside had seeped into their blood. After the meal, the younger excused herself, her voice unsteady but polite. She carried a candlestick down the long hall, her steps quick against the floorboards, each one echoing louder than the last. She retreated to the drawing room, a space lined with shelves of books and an old pianoforte that no one had touched in years. The storm raged against the windows, and in that room she paced, clutching the candlestick as if it were the only thing anchoring her. Her breath came shallow, her mind circling back to the same bitter thoughts, always second, always controlled, always living in someone else's shadow. The elder followed her soon after. The heavy door creaked open, and there she stood, framed by the glow of the hallway lamp, her face pale in the flickering light. She did not speak at first, only watch her sister pacing. When she finally did, her words were sharp, commanding, laced with the same authority that had defined her all her life. She told her younger sister to stop behaving like a child, to remember her place, to accept that everything was being done for her own good. Her voice rose above the storm outside, cutting through the thunder like a blade. The younger snapped. Her voice trembled as she shouted back, years of swallowed resentment breaking free all at once. She accused her sister of stealing everything from her freedom, her worth, even her future. Her words poured out like fire, unrelenting, unstoppable. She said she felt trapped, suffocated, as if her life belonged to someone else. Tears burned her eyes, but her rage was stronger than her sorrow. For the first time, she stood toe-to-toe with the sister who had overshadowed her, and in that moment, she no longer cared about duty or reputation. The elder's response was cold, almost frightening in its control. She stepped forward, her voice low now but heavy with warning. She reminded the younger of the ruin that would follow if she broke away, of the disgrace their family could never recover from. She spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of loyalty. But beneath those words was something more desperate, a fear of being abandoned, of losing the one person she believed she could command. Her hand reached out, not in comfort but in restraint, as though she could physically keep her sister from slipping away. The younger recoiled, clutching the candlestick tighter. Her breath was ragged, her vision blurred with rage. She begged her sister to let her go, to release her, to stop suffocating her life. The elder pressed harder, her voice rising again, telling her she would destroy them both if she dared defy her. The storm outside thundered so loud it rattled the glass, but neither sister heard it anymore. The only sound that mattered was their voices, clashing like blades, years of pain condensed into this single night. And then it happened. The elder grabbed her sister's wrist, her grip iron-tight, nails digging into flesh. The younger, shaking with fury, lifted the candlestick with her free hand. It was not planned. It was instinct raw and reckless, a violent cry for freedom. The brass struck the elder's temple with a sickening crack. Her body staggered, her hands slipping away, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. She gasped, tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. A second blow came, driven by panic more than rage, and she collapsed onto the carpet, her body twisting awkwardly as the candle fell, its flames sputtering out against the fabric. The room fell into silence, broken only by the storm outside and the ragged sobs of the younger sister. She dropped the candlestick, her hands trembling, her breath uneven. She fell to her knees beside the body, her tears streaming as she touched her sister's face, whispering her name over and over as if sheer will could bring her back. But the elder's eyes, once sharp and commanding, were now glassy, unblinking, fixed on nothing. Blood trickled slowly across the pale skin of her forehead, seeping into her hair and staining the carpet beneath her. The younger's mind spiraled. She had not meant for this, at least not like this. She had only wanted her freedom, only wanted to be heard, to be seen. Now the weight of what she had done pressed on her chest so heavily she could barely breathe. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out the thunder, the wind, everything but the unbearable truth of the body before her. For a moment, she thought of screaming for help, of calling the servants, of confessing. But another thought rose quickly, louder, more desperate. If anyone knew, it would mean ruin. Not only for her, but for her entire family. The whispers would spread like wildfire. The Cunningham name dragged through the mud, their father destroyed in his final years. Her life would not be her own. It would belong to the world, to the courts, to the gallows. So she sat there in the dim candlelight, her hands stained with blood, rocking back and forth as if she could turn back time by sheer motion. Denial flooded her thoughts. Perhaps her sister still breathed. Perhaps she could wake. She pressed her ear against her chest, prayed for a heartbeat, begged for a sign. But there was nothing. The silence was deafening, absolute. When at last she rose, her legs weak beneath her, her mind had shifted. Panic gave way to survival. She could not let this be known. She wiped her face, though the tears kept falling, and lifted her sister's lifeless body with shaking arms. She dragged her across the carpet, the fabric darkening with streaks of blood. Each movement was heavy, each breath a sob, yet she forced herself onward. She thought only of concealment, of erasing the act, of hiding the evidence of her rage. The storm outside masked the sounds of her struggle, the thunder swallowing the creaks of the floor and the dull thud of the body against the wood. No one came to check. No servant dared leave their quarters in such weather. She was alone in the vast house, alone with the terrible truth of what she had done by the time she laid her sister down in the cellar. Her arms ached and her dress clung damp with sweat and blood. She stood over her, trembling, whispering apologies, prayers, curses all tangled together. The cellar smelled of damp earth and old stone, its shadows swallowing the pale figure at her feet. She covered her with a sheet, as though the thin fabric could hide both the body and her guilt. Then she stood in the dark, staring at the still form, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. She had crossed the line from which there was no return, and though she had convinced herself it was survival, deep inside she knew the truth, that in that moment of fury, she had wanted it. She had wanted the silence, the freedom, the the shadow that had suffocated her for so long. But the silence that followed was not freedom. It was heavier than any chain she had ever known. And as the storm broke above the estate, lightning flashing across the countryside, the younger Cunningham sister understood that her life, no matter how carefully she hid this night, would never be the same again. The storm that had cloaked the night of the crime passed by morning, leaving the Cunningham estate draped in a deceptive calm. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, painting the rooms in a golden glow that belied the darkness still clinging to its halls. Birds sang in the garden, carriages rattled along the distant road, and yet within the house, silence pressed harder than ever. The younger sister moved through the rooms with her face pale and her steps measured, her body carrying the stiffness of one who had not slept. Every sound made her flinch. Every creak of the floorboards felt like an accusation. She returned often to the cellar, drawn to it by a pull she could neither resist nor explain. She would stand there in the damp air, staring at the still form beneath the sheet. At times she whispered apologies, she whispered blame, and at times she whispered nothing at all, just stood listening to the echo of her own breath. The truth of what she had done pressed against her chest like a stone. She told herself it had been an accident, the strike born of fear and fury. But no matter how many times she repeated it, the memory of raising the candlestick haunted her. She could still feel the weight of it in her hand, the shock that followed the crack of brass against bone. The servants, unaware of what had happened, grew uneasy. They noticed the elder sister's absence and whispered about illness or travel. The younger gave them explanations in clipped tones, saying her sister was resting, that she needed quiet, that she was not to be disturbed. At first, the lies passed without much question, but as the hours turned to days, suspicion grew. The elder Cunningham had never been one to hide herself away for long. She was the commanding presence of the household, the one who gave orders, who corrected faults, who ensured appearances were kept. Without her, the estate felt off balance, the routines disrupted, the silence unnatural. Their father, weakened by age and illness, asked questions that pierced the younger to her core. Where was his eldest? Why had she not come to sit by his side? Why did he not hear her voice in the halls? The younger offered reassurances, her smile trembling, her hands shaking as she poured him his tea. She lied to him again and again, each word tearing at her until she could hardly bear his gaze. The guilt gnawed at her, yet still she could not bring herself to speak the truth. To do so would mean not only her own ruin, but his heartbreak, his shame, his utter undoing. She told herself she was protecting him, even as she drowned in the weight of her deceit. In the village, whispers began. People spoke of how strange it was not to see both sisters together, of how unusual it was that the elder had not attended Sunday service. Neighbors asked questions politely, their voices laced with curiosity that threatened to sharpen into suspicion. The Cunningham name had always carried weight, but it also carried attention, and any break from its rigid pattern drew notice. The younger found herself trapped in endless small lies, each one spinning out from the last, until she barely remembered what she had said to whom. Inside her own mind, she was unraveling. Sleep came in fitful fragments, broken by visions of her sister's face. Eyes wide in shock, lips parted as though trying to form one last word. She woke drenched in sweat, her body shaking, the sheets twisted around her like restraints. By day, she carried herself with forced composure, though every glance from the servants made her wonder if they knew, if they could smell the truth on her. She heard footsteps in empty halls, whispers in rooms where no one stood, the echo of her sister's voice carried by the wind. The house that had once been her cage now became her torment, each corner filled with shadows that accused her. Her father's health declined further, his worry over his missing daughter gnawing at him. The younger watched him with a mix of pity and dread, knowing the truth would shatter him, but also knowing her silence was doing the same. She wanted to confess, to pour it all out and beg for forgiveness, yet her fear was stronger. She feared the gallows, the trial, the ruin of the Cunningham name. She feared the stares of the villagers, the whispers of society, the certainty that she would be remembered not as a daughter or a sister, but as a murderer. Rumors swelled beyond the village. Travelers passing through Warwickshire carried with them tales of the missing Cunningham sister, stories that grew with each telling. Some said she had eloped with a secret lover. Others claimed she had fallen ill and been hidden away. A few whispered darker possibilities, that something had gone terribly wrong inside that grand stone house, that the silence was more than just mourning. For a family so bound by reputation, the stain of rumor was almost as destructive as the truth itself. The younger felt the world closing in on her. She began to withdraw further, her once polished appearances at social gatherings replaced by excuses and absences. Her isolation only fueled the suspicion of others. Those who had once admired her now wondered what she was hiding. To them, the Cunninghams had always been untouchable, a family too proud to fall. And so, when cracks appeared, they stared all the more eagerly, waiting for the whole facade to collapse. Inside her own heart, the younger waged war with herself. At times, she clung to denial, convincing herself that her sister's death had been an accident, that she had no choice. At other times, guilt consumed her, convincing her she was no better than a monster. She tried to pray, but the words felt hollow. She tried to justify her actions, telling herself she had only sought freedom, but the memory of her sister's lifeless body whispered back that freedom had come at too great a price. The toll was not hers alone. The servants moved about the house with unease, their loyalty strained by the secrecy surrounding their employers. Their father withered, his once commanding presence fading into frailty. The community, once deferential, grew bold in its speculation. Even the walls of the estate seemed to betray them, their silence no longer protective but damning, as if the house itself carried the secret and longed to speak it aloud. And still, the younger endured it in silence. Each day, she carried herself like someone balancing on a blade, knowing that a single slip would expose everything. She tried to keep the world convinced that nothing was amiss, but in her heart, she knew the truth could not remain hidden forever. Secrets, especially deadly ones, had a way of clawing their way to the surface. The Cunningham estate, once a symbol of power and respect, became instead a house of whispers, its legacy stained by absence and unease. Where once there had been admiration, now there was doubt. Where once there had been order, now there was only fragility. And though no one beyond those stone walls yet knew the truth, the younger sister lived each moment as though the world already judged her. She could not escape the shadow of what she had done, for even in death her sister's presence lingered, heavier than it had ever been in life. The aftermath was not a single event, but a slow unraveling, a tightening of ropes that bound tighter with each passing day. The younger carried her guilt like a shroud, her silence like a curse. And though she told herself she had acted to protect her family, to preserve their name, she knew in her heart that what she had done could never be undone. The ripples of that night spread outward still, touching not only her, but everyone who had ever lived in the shadow of the Cunningham estate. The truth did not stay hidden forever. It never does. The walls of the Cunningham estate, thick as they were, could not silence absence, nor could the younger sister's trembling voice hold back questions that grew louder with time. The villagers, once merely curious, became convinced something unnatural had happened within those ivy-covered walls. Servants, pressed with whispers and suspicious glances, began to slip pieces of the truth into the ears of others. What started as a rumor hardened into belief. The elder Cunningham sister had not disappeared by choice, nor by illness. She was gone in a way that could not be spoken without dread. The discovery came slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the world had to tear back layers of silence piece by piece. When the elder's body was found at last, hidden away in the damp cellar, the shock rippled through Warwickshire like a stone cast into still water. The Cunningham name, once synonymous with order and prestige, now carried the weight of scandal and horror. People who had once admired the family crossed the street to avoid their gaze. Women whispered at market stalls, men shook their heads at taverns, and children, with their cruel innocence, made games of telling ghost stories about the sisters. The younger could no longer deny what she had done. Pulled into the harsh light of truth, she confessed, sometimes through tears, sometimes with a hollow voice that sounded nothing like her own. Her words shifted with her moods. It had been an accident, it had been self-defense, it had been fury she could not control. Yet in every version, the fact remained unchanged. Her sister was dead by her hand. The court that judged her cared little for the nuances of jealousy, fear, or control. What mattered to them was the act itself, the violence committed, and the stain it had left on a family that had once been untouchable. The trial drew crowds from far beyond Warwickshire. Spectators came to see the once admired Cunningham daughter, now reduced to a figure scandal. Newspapers printed every detail, some true, some twisted for drama, their ink soaking into pages that would be read and passed from hand to hand. In parlors and taverns, the case became entertainment, a story of beauty and brutality that allowed others to feel both horrified and superior. The younger sister, once invisible beside her elder, now had all eyes fixed upon her, though not in the way she had ever desired. When the verdict was delivered, it seemed less about justice and more about appeasing Tish. A collective hunger for resolution. Some argued she deserved death, others that she was a victim of a family that had crushed her under its weight. In the end, the punishment struck a balance between severity and mercy, though it satisfied no one completely. She would spend the rest of her life confined, stripped of freedom, her days shaped not by family duty, but by the cold walls of a cell. For her, It was a bitter irony. She had killed for freedom, yet found herself more trapped than ever. Her father did not live to see the end of it. The scandal, the trial, the relentless shame, it broke what little strength he had left. He faded into death quietly, carrying with him the knowledge that the legacy he had worked so hard to preserve had been destroyed by the very bond he had once believed was his daughter's greatest strength. For the Cunningham line, there was no recovery. The estate, once filled with the weight of tradition and expectation, became a shell of what it had been, haunted not only by death but by disgrace. The wider society, so eager to devour the details of the case, found in it more than just entertainment. It became a mirror for their own fears and suspicions. Families whispered more closely about the dangers of pride, of control, of daughters given too much or too little freedom. The case sparked debates in parlors and courtrooms alike. Was the younger sister a monster, or was she a victim driven to the edge by years of suffocation? Was her crime born of malice, or of desperation? The answer shifted depending on who spoke, revealing more about the speaker's own fears than about the crime itself. In time, the Cunningham case became more than just a tragedy. It became a cautionary tale. It highlighted the dangerous weight of silence, the suffocating nature of control, and the way power within families could twist love into something cruel. It exposed the fragility of reputation, how quickly respect could curdle into scorn. And perhaps most of all, it forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, that beneath the polished surfaces of wealth and civility lay shadows no less dark than those found in the poorest alleys. For the younger Cunningham, her punishment did not end with confinement. It lived in her mind, in the echo of her sister's voice, in the memory of the candlestick striking flesh, in the silence that followed. Each night, she lay awake, haunted by both guilt and defiance. Some nights, she wept for forgiveness. Another night, she clung to the thought that she had only sought freedom, that she had been driven to it. But in the quiet hours of dawn, when the world was still and the truth was clearest, she knew she could never escape what she had done. Justice, in the end, was a matter of perspective. The law had spoken, the public had judged, and yet no verdict could ever untangle the knot of love, control, jealousy, and fear that had led to that fatal night. The younger sister's life was ruined, the elder's life stolen, and a family's name shattered beyond repair. If justice meant balance, then none was found here. There was only loss for every person touched by the tragedy. The Cunningham sisters' story endures not because of its violence alone, but because it captures the uneasy truth of human relationships. It shows how love can twist into control, how duty can smother, how silence can destroy. It reminds us that wealth does not shield one from the darker corners of the heart, that reputation is fragile, and that even within the CLO, cessed bonds, jealousy, and resentment can grow until they consume everything that, in the end, the Cunningham name faded from Warwickshire, remembered less for its land or wealth than for the secret that tore it apart. The house fell into disrepair, its stone walls crumbling as though even they could not bear to hold the weight of what had happened within them. Villagers passed by and told their children to hush their voices, whispering tales of the sisters who had once lived there, one whose shadow had been too heavy and one whose freedom came at too high a price. The story leaves us with no easy answers. Was a younger sister's act one of evil or of desperation? Was justice served? Or was it twisted by society's hunger for punishment? Perhaps the truth lies in the uncomfortable space between, where morality is not clear and human behavior cannot be neatly explained. What is certain is that the Cunningham sisters' deadly secret revealed more than just a crime. It revealed the fragile balance of power, love, and fear that lives within us all.